Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming today. We will be getting started in just a few minutes. Welcome. Going to wait for more people to get logged in. Start soon. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We'll be getting started in just another minute here as folks continue to join. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for signing in to the webinar this morning. This is the third installment of IEC's Condition of the State, covering the impacts and costs of excess coal generation in the state of Iowa. And we are looking forward to talking with you about some important topics today. Steve, you have control of the slides, correct? We can move forward. So the presentation today is going to be in webinar format. So all attendees are off camera and muted by default. Please use the Q&A tool down at the bottom of the screen to put in questions as Steve gives his presentation. If you have questions that come to mind, please go ahead and put those in as we go along. And we will, at the end, get to your questions. or if I can answer them along the way during the presentation, I'll do that, but we'll save most Q&A until the end. And then if you have any technical issues, please, that's where you could use the chat function. Thanks. So the Iowa Environmental Council, we are a statewide nonprofit, non-governmental organization. We are focused on 2 areas of clean energy and clean water, with climate change really an overarching issue that both of our programs work on. We do policy, research and advocacy, education, and outreach around these issues. And we have more than 90 member organizations and businesses across the state and 16 professional staff members. So our main presenter today is going to be Steve Geyer, our Energy and Climate Policy Specialist. Steve brings decades of experience in the utility sector and environmental regulation. He is an attorney and serves, has his own solar business and serves as our Energy and Climate Policy Specialist here at the Council. I am Carrie Johansson. I'm the Energy Program Director with the Council. And you will see me again at the end when it's time for Q&A. And I'll turn it over to Steve.
Thanks, Carrie. So let's start by going through the items that we'll cover today. So some of this will be a repeat from anyone who attended one of the first 2 webinars. And it's just to bring everyone up to speed so that we're all on the same page. So we'll look at 20 years of change. What's happened to generation in Iowa over the past 20 years? We'll look at the cost of generation and sort of explanations as to why actually we're seeing this change. We'll look at the coal plant generation in Iowa. We'll look at a wholesale trend, what's been happening in terms of Iowa generation wholesale being sold to others not in the retail format. We'll look at how we characterize what we're deeming excess coal generation in the state, the plants that could be retired because of that. But then we'll shift into looking at what are the impacts of running these plants. So we'll look at the excess emissions and the waste. Then we're going to shift into externalities. We'll explain what externalities are. And now we're going to quantify them. We're going to basically put dollar amounts to those externalities. And that'll involve also health, the climate change, and crop loss. All those are externalities. And then we'll add that to the cost of generation in the state. And we're going to come up with the true cost of generation. And we'll look at the aspects of how fossil, and particularly coal, compares against wind. So let's start with the change that's occurred. And we can see from the graph, coal obviously was in 2000 the dominant source. In fact, gas and wind were almost non-existent in the state. But starting in about 2014, you'll see that we started to see a dramatic shift where coal started to decline and wind started to increase. We also have an increase in gas, but certainly the dominant force now is wind. And in fact, in 2019, as you can see, it actually exceeded coal generation in the state. And by 2020, wind actually represented 60% of the generation in the state. So let's understand why. So cost of generation. So this is something showing us then what generation actually costs. This is based on Lazard's most recent, showing us basically where they believe generation costs are currently. And what we'll see is that if we go down to conventional on the bottom, we'll see basically that all of those forms are clearly higher than as we move up to the top, which is renewable energy. And you'll notice that wind and solar are by far the lowest cost sources today for generation, and is very competitive. In fact, actually beats any of the fossil generation, and certainly is also beating the nuclear. And so now let's take a quick look at what does that really mean in terms of, how have our plants been running in the state? And so we'll look at each company. The first we'll look at is Alliant. And so these are the plants that they have in the state. And you'll notice this is basically 4 years worth. So we're looking from 2017, 18, 19, and 20. And you can see that over the time that we're looking at here, each of these plants is starting to show less and less in terms of how they're being utilized in the state. To the right, obviously we have some gas plants. You'll see that the gas plants, Emory and Marshalltown MGS, Clearly, a huge portion, I'll just say, of the generation for Alliant is actually shifted over to gas, and the fossil, in terms of coal, has been on the decline. Then we'll take a look for the same thing for MidAmerican. And although the only gas plant on here is Greater Des Moines, you'll notice that the coal plants certainly are all seeing a decline. 2018, we saw some increase, but then since then, we clearly are seeing a decline. Then we're going to talk about how is energy actually sold and what does it actually mean in the state in terms of who the energy is sold to and how it's characterized. And so the green basically represents the megawatt hours for MEC, MidAmerican, and Alliant that's being sold to the customers. You can see that MidAmerican has an increase over this time frame of having increased customer load. Now, a customer is somebody that has a meter, a retail meter, and that's how it's characterized in terms of, again, whether it's a customer or energy that's in the gold, that's deemed to be wholesale. So those aren't customers. Those are basically other utilities in the marketplace that buy energy. You can also see we have fairly substantial amount of wholesale basically for MidAmerican and an increase over time. Same thing with Alliant. You can see that the customer load actually is fairly stable, but we're seeing an increase in terms of wholesales, and again, sales to other utilities. In fact, to quantify this, so in 2020, MidAmerican sold 26.5 million megawatt hours to its customers, and Alliant sold 13.9 million megawatt hours. But both of those utilities, if we look at that wholesale, so in 2020, 29% of MidAmerican's 2020 generation was sold to other utilities, and 20% of the Alliance generation was sold to other utilities. That amounted to 11.2 million megawatt hours to utilities for MidAmerican for 124.3 million, and Alliance sold 3.7 million megawatt hours to utilities for 103.6 million. So now we're going to take a look at how we're characterizing excess generation. So clearly, generation has impacts on the environment. And as we look at the various resources available, clearly coal is the resource that has the greatest environmental damage and the greatest impact on us. And so that's the resource that clearly we're going to list as the least basically preferable source of energy. We'll start with renewable because clearly renewable has no real economic impact. It doesn't burn a fuel. And so when we subtract them, we take the customer load. We start with that. Now we're going to subtract the wind generation, and you'll see that it was significant for both utilities. Then we're going to subtract nuclear, and although nuclear certainly, again, has issues, it also probably is, it certainly is preferable to a fossil resource. Then we're going to look at other resources and fossil resources. So other resources, this comes from information where the utilities are required to disclose their sources of energy. And so other usually means that they purchased it on the grid. And so unfortunately, that's not characterized in terms of the resource that it's actually coming from, but we are in a region where we have an abundance of wind. And so a lot of that is likely to be wind resources that we're actually purchasing. And then we'll subtract fossil gas, although it's a fossil resource. If we look at it from an overall emission standpoint, it doesn't have nearly the emissions that a coal resource does. Now, when we subtract those resources, you'll notice that we come to basically a zero in terms of what we actually needed to serve those customers. And so everything basically then that was generated by that coal plant or those coal plants, we deemed to be excess generation. It wasn't needed to serve the Iowa customers. And so we'll see that MidAmerican had 7.2 million megawatt hours and Alliant had 3.2 million megawatt hours. So let's look at the impact in terms of where are these resources in terms of the coal plants. I suspect most people don't know where these coal plants are actually located. So here we have basically, again, not only what we deem to be all of the unnecessary coal resources, but we have Lansing, that's an Alliant plant up in Lansing. Prairie Creek is in Cedar Rapids. That's an Alliant plant. Loiza is a joint dome plant down around Muscatine. Ottumwa, as the name implies, is also a joint dome plant, but it's in Ottumwa. The Walter Scott plants are over in Council Bluffs, and the Neal plants are up in Sioux City area. Most of these plants basically are jointly owned between Alliant, MidAmerican, and other co-ops, et cetera, with the exception of Lansing, Prairie Creek, and although a plant's not shown on here, Burlington is also an Alliant plant, but it's switching from coal to gas actually as we speak. But importantly, that means that we had 10.4 million megawatt hours basically that released emissions into the air and placed fly ash in our landfill, in the landfills basically, and those all have environmental impacts. So what we wanted to do then is take that and sort of look at, well, what are those excess emissions? What basically does it do in terms of impacting our environment? And so as we go to this slide, we'll see that it's significant. So total sulfur dioxide emissions of 14.5 basically 1,000 tons. Basically same with nitrogen oxides. We've got almost 10,000 tons. Mercury, which is extremely, I'll just say, potent in terms of a contaminant, 74 pounds. But that 74 pounds can contaminate an awful lot of water within the state, because the mercury basically goes up and then deposition brings it down and deposits in the waterways. And then as I think everyone has seen recently, greenhouse gases. So 15.5 million tons of carbon dioxide were emitted just from that generation in the state last year, having a significant impact in terms of climate change and certainly exacerbating and causing some of the issues we're seeing and the effects of climate change. And then fly ash. So 211,000 tons placed in landfills. And although they're monofills, meaning that's the only type of waste in the landfill, so the landfills are owned by the utility, but they have contaminants. Every metal and contaminant basically that comes in the coal will ultimately have a portion of that end up in the fly ash. And even if the landfill is lined, ultimately that fly ash has the future potential of contaminating groundwater at some point in time. So now we're going to start and we're going to quantify the aspects of what does this mean in terms of externalities that are caused by emitting these excess emissions. And so the COBRA model is used by EPA to put a monetary value on basically what this actually causes. And so based on that information previously on the previous slide in terms of the tonnages of contaminants, whether it's sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide, or mercury, the model produces estimates. And as you can see, the way we quantify this is not only in terms of mortalities, but things like hospital stays and asthma exacerbation, even lost work days. And so those all have dollar values associated with those. And so as we look at this, you can see that based just on that generation last year is significant. And so we're looking at an externality, or in other words, a cost that is incurred by Iowans that's not actually recognized. Or think of it like this. Think of it like it's taxing Iowans in a manner that they're not aware of. And so we're looking at high to low of 64 million to 145 million, again, based on the emissions from last year. And PM 2.5 also is in there, even though it's not on the previous chart. That also is something has a huge impact in terms of respiratory health frankly, for Iowans. So let's talk about climate change. So we've addressed it just a little bit, but climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, and one of the largest sources in the country and even in the state are those CO2 emissions from combusting the fossil fuels. That can be both not only the coal, which is what we're addressing here, but carbon dioxide is also released from gas plants at roughly half the amount of what a coal plant emits. But the coal itself is a huge aspect in terms of CO2, where, think of it as a multiplier. So that coal itself may contain 68% carbon, and for each gram of carbon, then it produces approximately 4 grams of CO2. So, as you can see, that 10 million megawatt hours basically produces a significant amount of CO2. And so that's an externality. And so think about climate change in terms of what we're already seeing, but here are the effects. These are the consequences of climate change. So we're seeing rising temperatures, we're seeing, rising sea levels, we're seeing drought, we're seeing heat waves, we're seeing the heavy rainfall, the intense rainfalls that we've been experiencing recently. And something that we don't necessarily see, but species loss. These are all effects basically from climate change. And certainly the one that we saw in Iowa probably most recently, and I think why it's sort of top of mind, is the derecho, which clearly had a huge impact monetarily on the state. In other words, it's a clear externality that although it occurred, we didn't really account for it monetarily. So to do that, the government has what they call the social cost of carbon. So again, social cost of carbon. Recently, and this was a value that existed, I'll just say, in the previous two administrations ago, at $51 per ton. And it was recently recast and readopted as far as how we account for greenhouse gas emissions in regulatory actions and in other actions. And so at $51 per ton, that's sort of what they consider to be the low value at the social cost. And in fact, the high value is considered to be closer to $250 per ton and possibly even higher. And so if we take a look at that then, and again, we take that 16 million tons of CO2 and multiply times the 51 and the 250. And so we end up with a value of $865 million to $2.58 trillion. That's a significant amount of money. And again, it's an externality. We're not having to account for it. Part of the talk right now is that's why we talk about a carbon tax, that if we really were accounting for it, then you would place a value on carbon itself, and that would basically help to, I'll just say, offset these costs that are occurring, but we're not paying for them at this point in time. And so there's another externality, and for those who I think saw the last webinar, based on a study out of California, where probably something that wasn't previously recognized but is becoming recognized, is that these coal plants actually have an impact on the production and the amount of coal. And so the underlying study looked at coal plants that had closed, and many of those plants were in Iowa, and it was over a period of 10 years. And what they observed was that after the coal plants closed, then the corn production yields actually increased. And so using that as a basis, they extrapolated to determine what would be and what is the annual loss due to the remaining coal in the state. And so using that, we had a minimum and an average loss. And this is, by the way, per county. And so the results show that about 2/3 of the counties were being impacted or are being impacted, loss of production from the continuing operation of the coal plants. And so we basically then determined what is that annual statewide loss. And so you can see, it could be anywhere from 66 million at a minimum level to probably an average loss per year of 330 million bushels. And then utilizing a 2021 average of 558 cents per bushel, we come up with, again, substantial numbers, basically, almost $2 trillion at a maximum level, and let's just say about 400 million or 350 million in terms of the minimum. Again, substantial amount externalities that are not being accounted for directly. So let's take a moment to sort of look at the aspects of, what are our options in terms of how do we basically have the ability to meet our generation needs, and can we do it in a different manner? And so looking back then, as we just showed in terms of the yield loss from the coal generation. So let's suppose that we went to 100% renewable in the state. And based on previous studies, we've determined that, in fact, the studies have shown that for Iowa to be 100% renewable, we may need 46,000 megawatts of solar, and we may need 61,000 megawatts of wind to be 100% renewable in the state. So the annual statewide loss, let's suppose that we had to put that much renewable in the state. And so a calculation determines the total number of acres, and then utilizing a 2019 Iowa average yield in terms of per acre, we can see that that would result in 36 million bushels for solar and 9 million for wind. And so even if we total that in terms of 45 million bushels lost, that's really a fraction, and I'll just flip the slide back so you can see a fraction of what we're losing in terms of just because of the coal plants themselves. In fact, it's basically substantially less than even the minimum lost due to the coal. So let's quantify. So we had 3 different forms of externalities. We used COBRA to determine our health cost. We've got the results in terms of corn loss, again, based on a California study, and then social cost of CO2. And so if we look at those, and then we had minimums, we had maximums, but if we total those, we come up again with substantial sums. But now let's basically divide that by that 10.5 million kilowatt hours. And we're going to come up basically with 13 cents and 44 cents per kilowatt hour. So they're substantial amounts. And so if we take a look at what does that really mean, again, it means that now let's look at sort of adding that to our costs of generation within the state. And so as we look at the generation, so these are the coal plants that we previously looked at. And so they're required to report on FERC Form 1 what it is that they're showing as their operating cost for each of these plants. And so you'll see that the coal plants are all basically 2, even one of them at 5 cents. But then we look at wind. So we have a wind farm from MEC and a wind farm from Alliant at 1 cent. So even on the FERC form, the wind is showing that it is far more cost effective. And in fact, all of the coal plants are at least 2 times that, if not 5 times that, as we look at, for instance, Neil 4, which has a very high cost. But now let's take into account the externalities. And so if we added up those externalities that we did on the previous slide, and now we're going to add that 13 cents or that 44 cents to each of those. And so that will give us a minimum cost for each of those coal plants or a maximum cost for each of the coal plants. And so if we were accounting for externalities, you'll see that we are dramatically different. In fact, just the cost basically of the generation itself would range from 15 cents at a minimum to 47 or 49 cents at a maximum. So again, quantifying and think about this, these are the costs that we're incurring, but we're just incurring them in a different way. We incur them personally. So we incur them because we have more hospital visits. We incur them because we have storm damage. We incur them again because we didn't get the yield that we could have otherwise obtained. So externalities have a big play. Certainly, as I said before, part of what is being talked about nationally and has been for a long time. But I think as climate change continues to exacerbate, we're seeing more and more of a conversation of the need to account for it. And that may be through placing a value on the carbon itself. It may be through other mechanisms. But again, so this is one of the reasons that as we look at it, and even you can see it here. I mean, wind doesn't have the externalities. It's cheaper. It operates basically on resources that are free, whether it's the wind or the sun. And in fact, the system, as in previous presentations, the system can accommodate this. Even though we have a situation where we need to transition, we need to start transitioning now and move us to a situation where we don't have to either deal with the externalities or we move to a system basically that recognizes it monetarily. And with that, so again, we can go back and you can go back and look at the available resources. So you can see all of the series recordings of this webinar, and you can actually read the condition of the state papers also to look at further detail.
Great. Thanks a lot, Steve. There's a lot of really good data there, and we had some great questions come in as well as we went along. So, Steve, this is a question. First of all, I'm going to start with can you talk a little bit about what region of the grid we're talking about? And I think we might span a couple regions here, but if you can explain how this interacts with the regional markets.
Sure. So the primary, so MidAmerican and Alliant are within what's called MISO, so the Midwest Independent System Operator. So there are other regions that form a part of the national grid. So for instance, one is the Southwest Power Pool, one is PJM, which moves to the east. And so as entities within MISO, for instance, the utilities within MISO, they have the ability to sell within the marketplace. And it might be a utility, for instance, down in Missouri that is purchasing the wind from Iowa, as Iowa basically has wind available. Similarly, as long as we have sufficient transmission, same thing happens in Iowa. It might be far more economical for instance, the Iowa utilities be purchasing the wind from the Dakotas than it is to run their own plants. And so as a grid, that's sort of the advantage of being interconnected. It's also the advantage and the reason that as we look at expanding renewables, we need to have more transmission so that these become available and you're not reliant on the expensive resources, but you can actually bring economics of scale to all the customers. I'm not sure if that explains.
Yeah, there's just a general question about what region we were talking about. And then, so this is, I think, just looking for a little bit more of an explanation of what we were talking about when we talk about excess generation in the MISO market. All utilities sell their generation into the wholesale market and then buy it back. So are the sales to other utilities the sales into the wholesale market, or is there's something else we're talking about here?
There's some of both. So there are certain sales that are not just on the spot market transactions. There are certain sales that are under contract. So some utilities, for instance, there are utilities in Nebraska that have contracts to buy a certain amount of power from utilities here in Iowa. But a bulk of the transactions are actually marketplace transactions, and it's all based on, again, what the value of the energy is. And so within the marketplace, you have to put the price that you're willing to sell out there. And that's how basically the buyers then buy that energy. There also are issues in terms of there's capacity and energy. Most of what we're talking about in terms of these sales are energy sales. They're not capacity sales, although there are, again, contractual aspects for capacity sales too, where every utility, of course, has to have not only the capacity to meet their demand, but also the demand plus a reserve margin.
Okay. But these are wholesale sales in excess of what was required to serve Iowa customers. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about excess generation as well.
Right.
It's more complex than that, but.
Yes. So to simplify, a utility basically is obligated to meet the needs of its customers. And so outside of a sale under contract, so a wholesale under contract, then is merely sales that are being made for the most part, not to benefit the customer, but to actually benefit basically the underlying monetary aspects of the utility, which is also why you'll see an increasing trend in terms of why those sales keep going up. So as a utility has the ability to put more cheap assets, basically, and cheap generation on its system, then yes, it's going to basically be increasing those sales, but it's not sales made necessarily to meet the needs of the customer. And therefore, when we have generation from the coal plants, we're going to deem that, and we do deem that, to be excess generation because there are other ways to actually meet that. We can actually buy that energy in the market most times.
So I misunderstood the earlier question about the region. The question was actually about the EPA analysis and whether it was the MROW region that you were looking at. We may have to follow up on this question. I'm not sure I understand.
Yeah, I'm not I'm not sure.
Send us an email, Jim. We'll follow up with you on that. And then we start talking about a couple of elements here. One is whether the surplus coal generation is critical to grid stabilization. So the reliability question in the upper MISO region is the first question.
Sure. So, and I recognize what we're characterizing here is that as a system moves and transitions. Certainly grid stability is a concern, but there are ways to address it. Are the plants being used right now for that? I'm sure that, yes, I'm sure that sometimes they are in fact operating for that purpose, but that also feeds right back into the aspect of transmission, where if you had increased transmission, if you had basically storage capabilities, then you don't necessarily need those plants. And so again, this all comes up to transition. It all comes up to basically the aspect of there are other ways to actually achieve the same thing, including gas plants. So for instance, Greater Des Moines, if it had the ability to, for instance, increase its generation, it could provide that same stability that the coal plants can.
Okay, great. And then there's a question about to what extent the sales from the surplus coal generation are financially important for MEC and IPL.
Well, I'm sure that they view them as very, I'll just say beneficial for sure. Are they necessary? That comes back to an aspect of, again, a utility's obligation is to meet the needs of its customers. And so as a part of that equation, they're allowed to earn a return on their capital. They're allowed to basically earn everything they make in terms of their operating expenses. But in terms of, increasing the sales so that you can increase I'll just say the bottom line, sure, it benefits them, but the question comes back to, is that really a benefit to the customer, or is that more of a benefit to the shareholder? And so certainly, it clearly benefits the company. The question is more who really benefits from a customer perspective.
Thanks. So do we have a crystal ball about how the rapidly rising cost of natural gas that we're seeing is going to impact the price of natural gas-fired electricity over the coming months?
I can give you my crystal ball. Yes. I mean, just the announcement that both Alliant and MidAmerican made yesterday, sort of warning us about the escalation of natural gas prices. And so certainly, yes, I would expect that, as we look at, it'll impact Alliant, I think, clearly more than it will MidAmerican. MidAmerican doesn't really operate their gas plant that much. And so if they're having to offset the wind, they'll fall back to a coal resource. On the other hand, yeah, I mean, Alliant, yeah, it could play an impact. They basically have certainly far less coal generation, and yeah, they're going to have to pass along, because that is a pass through. I mean, that's a price on the gas itself, which comes through as a pass through. And even though it's not exactly the same in terms of the way it works in the natural gas system, it increases their cost of operation, and yes, they're going to have to recover that most likely through. They're going to have to try and find some way to compensate. Yeah, I don't have a crystal ball in terms of how much it will be or sort of how they will adjust, but I would say yes, it's going to have an impact. And in fact, if we look at nationally and even worldwide, what they're talking about right now is that we're seeing sort of a resurgence in coal right now due to that exact impact. Significant portions of the country, in fact, do and have shifted a lot of their generation because of economics to natural gas when it was cheaper. Now it's not, and so they'll shift back to the cheaper resource. Economics will always drive generation, always.
Great, and so we have a question about whether we can talk about how much of the energy that the utility companies are exporting is wind energy when it's in excess of Iowa load versus other resources.
I think all we can basically surmise is suppositions based on cost of generation, based on looking at MISO in terms of when you look at their the numbers they provide in terms of where the price of energy is at the various nodes in the hubs. It indicates that a lot of it certainly has to be wind. And as we look at the marketplace, again, every utility will try and basically obtain the lowest cost resource it can. I wouldn't go into the aspect in terms of must runs or units that basically are being operated that shouldn't be operated, but most utilities, in order to maximize profit, in fact, will always look for the lower cost. And so we know that regionally, the wind has been providing a greater and greater percentage in the state and regionally. And so the supposition is that most of that probably is wind.
Yeah, and that goes into another question about MidAmerican and Alliant claiming that they need fossil generation to supplement their renewable production to meet customer energy demand versus like an overall yearly average. And I think, Steve has talked about this a couple of different ways. It's a great question. There are different technologies that can provide the grid support that's needed for instantaneous power supply. And certainly they will argue that coal is the way to do that, but I think that, Steve will, coal plants aren't really designed to operate in that kind of a responsive manner. And there are a host of other technologies and systems that we need to transition to get to a 24 clean energy system to address climate change. But I'll let Steve talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I'll expand on that. So if we take a look at all of the coal plants that we're talking about, and if you looked at some of the graphs there in terms of the amount of generation on a decline, but a factor I haven't mentioned yet is capacity factor. So capacity factors are represent a percentage of, so the generation it produces, what's the total amount it could have produced? And the capacity factor is a percentage then of what actually, so let's say it's a 20% capacity factor, which a lot of the plants have been operating at. That means that it could have produced 5 times more energy potentially, but it's operating at a very low amount. And in fact, they are cycling these coal plants. And yes, that will lead to a long-term, I'll just say, or short-term, both, maintenance increases when they operate a coal plant like it's basically a peaker or like it's basically some intermediate type plant, because the stresses of taking it up and then basically bringing it down over a number of days, it stresses it. They weren't intended to operate that way, and when they do, we will end up shortly with increased operating expenses. So it will increase the cost even more than basically we're already showing. The other aspect too is we look at them, all those plants and capacity factors. So sure, maybe temporarily right now we need those for grid stability, but I suggest we don't need them all. And even that aspect of capacity factor, you don't necessarily need to operate 5 plants at 20%. You could operate 1 plant at 100%. And we actually have less impact, less cost on the overall system, and likely even provide the stability even today. So there are ways around, I'll just say, the way that it's being operated and the claims that are being made.
Yes, and I think that plays into a question about the economics. And the question is, if economics drives generation, and if Lazard says renewables like wind and solar are less expensive than coal and gas, then why on earth would utilities not switch to renewables versus coal?
Sure. And so even though they are, and I mean, we're still, the utility is still adding more every single year renewable. But yeah, the question comes back to why continue to operate? Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And I will just say that part of the dilemma, I'll just say, is when you have these assets out there, you're going to earn a return, again, on each of those assets. And so a coal plant has to remain, any asset you use has to remain what they call used and useful, meaning you have to use it in order to actually get a return on it. So I have an incentive to operate, even at a very low level. I have an incentive to operate just because I know I'm going to make a return on it, and not face the potential of having what's called a stranded asset, where now basically I have this asset that's not used. I still have a huge amount of capital invested in it that I haven't been able to recoup yet. So yes, there's a huge incentive to move towards renewables. There's also an incentive to look at other mechanisms that deal with these assets, and not let them become stranded, but even place them in a situation where, sure, you get to earn the capital you still have invested, but that doesn't mean you have to operate it. So there are ways we can get around this. There are mechanisms already in place in other states that have addressed the same issue.
Yes, I think one of the important things is how we regulate energy in Iowa. So it's a vertically integrated monopoly utility system, and so we really rely on regulators to be the ones who look at whether something is cost effective for customers versus the asset issue that Steve has talked about, where utilities want to recoup their investment, they want to earn a rate of return on it. MidAmerican in particular has a lot of excess generation capacity right now. They are well over what they actually need to serve Iowa customers. And so to, that is why we have regulation, but it's also, the costs that the utilities have producing the generation gets passed through to customers. And so they want to deliver to their shareholders, but they also have this guaranteed customer base that they can pass costs along to. So that's why it's really important to bring information about the costs, bring information about how the generation is being deployed and impacting people, in order to make sure that we have regulation that's really taking into account what's best for customers. And then let's see. So there's a question about the social cost of carbon. Does that include health costs? Does the social cost of carbon include health cost estimates and lost ag production? Just wondering if that was already wrapped into the social cost, if we might have been double counting there, or if it was something different.
It's a valid question. Certainly not in terms of the corn aspect, because that's what I said is an unrecognized one, and basically just recently, 2 years ago, sort of came to light as a result of that study. And by the way, the social cost of carbon was developed long before the study. So no, certainly that. Health impacts. Although it does basically address health impacts, it has a value for health impacts, but it's related more to, for instance, how does weather impact, whether it's heat or something like that. So those have health impacts. So it does have some, but it's not the same, for instance, as what's in COBRA. COBRA is actually looking not at the CO2, it's looking at the aspects of the pollutants, whether it's the sulfur dioxides, the PM 2.5s, the night, that's what is quantified. So although there's a possibility there could be some slight overlap, they all three look at different aspects and different impacts from the generation emissions.
And then there was a question, the tool that Steve was describing is securitization. And then there's a question about how the cost should be shared between ratepayers and shareholders for a stranded asset, which is pretty deep in the, that's a definite.
How the cost should be shared between. Yeah, I mean, that's a huge debate. I mean, clearly that is the issue. I mean, should the utility, have the ability to fully recover, or should it be something where the regulator says, well, you should have known better, and so the shareholder has to bear part of that risk. But certainly and let's go back to securitization. That's one of the things that securitization is intended to try and resolve by allowing the utility to make the full recovery, but not the recovery that they would have otherwise made. And so it sort of provides a balance between what the shareholder basically is still going to be able to get, and maybe it's not as much as before, but then it basically lightens the burden on the ratepayer because it lowers the cost of that stranded asset, or again, how much the utility is going to recover.
Great. Steve, can you talk again about, I think we had this on one of our slides, hopefully, but the percentage of MidAm's coal generation that served Iowans versus sales to utilities outside of the state, and then that same number for IPL?
Yeah, so the wholesale for 2020 for MidAmerican was 29%, and for Alliant it was 20%. 2020.
Yep. And then wondering about if we have a preferred form of carbon pricing, and whether we have an opinion about the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. So, I mean, I would just say about carbon pricing that it's not necessarily, my opinion is, it's not necessarily a bad tool, but it's not enough to get us all the way to where we need to go. When you have a pricing tool, certainly you can shift the economics of generation and people's decisions, et cetera. But often you just end up kind of shifting costs around. And if people can afford to pay it, they do. And so it's helpful. It won't get us all the way there. And I will let Steve, if he has a preferred carbon pricing method or any opinion on that act, I will turn it over to him for that.
Sure. So, yeah, I mean, over the years, I've seen many different proposed mechanisms. I mean, I guess I would view it this way. I mean, so for instance, a lot of times you've seen proposals that look at the input side of the equation. So there have been previous examples or attempts where you would increase the value, you would increase the price, for instance, of coal or oil. You would actually quantify the carbon contained within that and then price it at that level. There's also mechanisms that have looked at, pricing it on the emission, basically the downside of it. So is there a preferred mechanism? I guess I don't have a preferred mechanism. I think ultimately, whether it's on the input side or the downside, it's trying to recognize again an externality that otherwise is not being accounted for. And so in economics, that says we're going to try and level the field. We're basically going to try and basically, certainly show that, and would have, anything that uses a fossil fuel is clearly going to be, more expensive to operate with the price of carbon than the alternative, renewable electricity. And whether that's basically energy or whether it is looking at transportation, either one, it will show a marked difference in terms of the economics as we move forward. Yeah, does it achieve everything? Not really. I mean, we can try and use economic means to shift the equation, but I really think there also has to just be other, whether it's a infrastructure bill with incentives, or whether it is basically future let's just say legislation that looks at the aspects of clean energy standards, mandates in terms of basically percentages that we have to achieve by a certain point in time. That's an alternative to a carbon tax also.
Yeah, I think we need a really wide variety of policy tools across a lot of different sectors to get us where we need to be. Obviously today we're really focused on the electric sector, but there's a lot of work to be done over the next decade. So let's see here. Okay, so there's a question. Alliant announced that it plans to close the Lansing generating station by the end of 2022. There's a question about whether MidAm or Alliant have announced the closure of other plants in the near future. And Steve mentioned they're transitioning Burlington to natural gas, but there are no other announcements that we know of.
Other than Alliant saying that, there's not an actual announcement other than Alliant's internal pledge to get rid of all of its coal, which basically means, the joint domes and the Ottumwa by 2040.
Yep, that's true. All right. I think we've run through our Q&A, a lot of really, really good questions. And I know I always appreciate hearing more from Steve about some of the details of some of this. So I hope that folks found this helpful and educational. This is our last webinar in the Condition of the State series. I really hope that you go ahead and look through the paper for if you want to refer back to any of the statistics or anything like that in this webinar. We'll also have it available online soon to review and share if you would like. And then we will be planning to look again at the data as it comes out in 2022 to make an assessment of the direction we're going here in Iowa and where all these things stand. So we really appreciate everyone coming and joining us today. And for those of you who have stuck with us through this 3-part series, we hope it's been helpful. And please, reach out and be in touch with us with any questions or anything you need. So thanks, everyone.